Hello, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you. We've reached the vital hour of 8 o'clock, and a warm welcome to everyone. It's lovely that so many of you are coming here for this event. It's almost 60 households and rather more people than that. And now, a few words about our speaker. James Bettley is an architectural historian who, over the last 20 years, has revised the Pevsner volumes for Essex, Suffolk, and now Hertfordshire. He also finds time for a wide range of other public commitments. For instance, he is on the Church Buildings Council of the Church of England and chairs their Sculpture and Furnishings Committee. And last year, he was High Sheriff of Essex, his adopted county. So we know that we are in the hands of an expert for this evening, and now it's over to him.
Well, Malcolm, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Very nice to see so many people virtually, if not actually. But how lovely that you haven't even had to leave the comfort of your sofas to join us this evening. I shall now, without further ado, share the screen with the first slide and hope that everyone can see that.
Absolutely.
I shall take silence as consent. I'm sure this first slide will be, the picture on this first slide will be very familiar to everyone in the audience. It was actually about the first photograph I took of a Hertfordshire building on the 28th of January 2015, which is actually before I started serious work on Hertfordshire, but when I was just beginning to think of it and made a preliminary visit to Hertford. And I've chosen it partly because I love it as a photograph and I love it as a building, but it also happens to illustrate one or two preliminary points that I'd like to make. If we go on to the next slide. Oops. On the left there is a photograph that I took almost exactly a year later. And on the right is a photograph I took almost exactly a year after that. And you will see a noticeable difference between the two slides. And it illustrates one of the hazards of working on the Pevsner volumes in that in most cases, you only actually get one shot at visiting a place. Hertford was obviously exceptional because I was coming back to it time and again, mostly in order to go to the record office. But other places I might only have visited once or on a number of days at one particular time during the time that I was doing the research. So if that had been mid-2015 when I visited this place, by the time the book came out in 2019, I might not actually have been there for 4 years. So things could have happened in the meantime. And if my one visit to Hertford had been when that statue, that figure had been vandalized, I might have given a rather false impression of the building. The other point I'd like to make is that for various reasons, I've been away from Hertfordshire now for 18 months. So I'm not quite as on top of all the details of the places and names as I was back then. So if, for example, I were to say to you that this building is in St Andrew's Street in Hertford rather than in St Andrew Street, I hope you would not think too harshly of me. Anyway, as I say, my travels in Hertfordshire were mostly complete by May 2018, apart from visits to the record office. So they were spread over a period of about 3 years. And what we're dealing with here, obviously, is a new edition of the Hertfordshire volume of the Buildings of England series. And I expect many of you have copies of Pevsner Hertfordshire. It might look like the volume on the
Uh-huh.
So could someone's got their microphone on, if they could switch it off, please. On the left there is the first edition, 1953. In the middle is the same first edition, but with its dust jacket. And on the right is the 1977 revision by Bridget Cherry, a gap of 24 years. And then here is the 2019, the third edition, a gap of 42 years since the first edition of 1953. So in due course, I'm going to talk a bit about the differences between those editions. But before I get on to that, I'd like to say a little bit about Nicholas Pevsner himself, because he's one of those people whose name has entered the language, like Baedeker or Bradshaw or Wisdom. If someone says, I get my Pevsner, then they mean the Buildings of England volume, and he tends to be associated with the Buildings of England. But there was very much more to him than that, as I'm sure many of you know, but it's worth just reminding you a little bit about the man. Here are two photographs of him taken at different times in his life. The one on the left I'd like to think of as the very serious-minded German art historian, and the one on the right as a rather more genial character standing in front of an English timber-framed building. Pevsner was born in 1902 in Leipzig, and everyone thinks of him as a German, but he was actually Russian. He was born Russian Jewish stock, and he was known as a child as Nika, which was short for Nikolai. So he only later became Nicholas, and in fact his parents stayed Russian until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, when they became German. Pevsner was educated at the universities of Leipzig, Munich, Berlin, and Frankfurt, which to English eyes seems a little bit excessive, but the system in Germany was that you didn't follow necessarily a particular course at a single university, as we do in this country, but you identified particular courses given by particular professors wherever they happened to be, and you went to them. His first job was as assistant keeper of the Dresden Art Gallery and lecturer in the history of art at Göttingen, and his first published books were on German Baroque architecture and Italian painting. So I think you can see from that already the great breadth of his knowledge and learning, which is one of his great strengths. He came to England in 1933 because because of his Jewish blood, he immediately lost his university positions once the Nazis came to power. He never actually considered himself to be a refugee, and he always had this rather ambivalent attitude towards the Nazi regime, which some people have rather latched on in recent years. But as I say, he never considered himself as a refugee. You might almost nowadays we might almost call himself an economic migrant. He very quickly, once he'd come to England, which wasn't incidentally his first choice, he'd much rather have gone to Italy, but he did very quickly establish himself. And in 1936, he published a book called Pioneers of Modern Design, from William Morris to Walter Gropius, actually published it in English, but based on lectures that he'd given in Göttingen. And it's important, the title from William Morris, i.e. English designer, to Walter Gropius, i.e. German designer, he was always looking for this common thread and always a European context, which is something that he applied to his studies of English art and architecture. In 1937, he published an inquiry into industrial art in England, which is where these illustrations come from. And this covered industrial art, covered textiles, saucepans, motor cars, packaging. Again, I just show you that to demonstrate that he was very much more than just an art historian. When war broke out in 1939, he was interned for a short time, and then came back to London, where he spent a lot of his time sweeping up damage on the London streets, but he also started lecturing at Birkbeck College, University of London, which is where he continued to teach for the rest of his academic career. In 1942, he published The Outline of European Architecture, an immensely influential work in the sense that anyone who studies art history, they will read this book at one point or another. And the introduction starts with this, sentence, which has become iconic, really. A bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture. And then he proceeds to elaborate on that distinction. It's a very good working definition, although it does, in having made that definition, it does intrigue me that the series of books we're talking about is called The Buildings of England, rather than Great Architecture of England or anything like that. So you could say that it lays the way open for a bicycle shed to be included. And in fact, in Hertfordshire, I came very close to including a bicycle shed. I was quite excited to discover this, a cycle shelter at Rothamsted Experimental Station at Harpenden, which comes from Paul Mauger's Buildings in the Country, 1959. Alas, it's no longer there, the cycle shelter. So I was unable to indulge in this sort of, what was really a sort of private joke. Now, he became editor of the Architectural Review, the leading architectural magazine of the day. He was editor from 1942 to 1945, and also from 1942, he was editor of the King Penguin series, which again will be familiar to many of you. These rather a lovely series of little hardback books. English Tradition and Design is just one I choose to show here. And again, it's a reflection of his own interest in what was then called industrial design. Now, the Outline of European Architecture and, of course, the King Penguins were both published by Alan Lane, who had founded Penguin Books in 1935. And Pevsner got on very well with Alan Lane, and there was a famous, almost sort of mythical occasion when Alan Lane said to Pevsner, if you could do anything in the publishing line, what would you like to do? And he said, I would like to do a multi-volume series on the history of art, and I would like to do a multi-volume series on the buildings of England. And Alan Lane said, fine, go ahead. And so that was the Pelican History of Art and the Buildings of England series. Now, the Buildings of England, that was based on a German series that had started in 1906, but became something very, very different in Pevsner's hands. Work started on this in 1945 with German refugee art historians as his research assistants. Later, he went on to use typically Courtauld postgraduate students. Now, for this series, The Buildings of England, Pevsner was not just the editor, he was the actual author. And that's very important, really, because it was hugely significant in actually getting the work done. There have been other series, similar series, notably the Shell Guides, which have an editor and a number of different authors, perhaps specific to the counties under discussion. But a lot of these other series tended to peter out rather once the editors had worked through their list of friends who lived in far-flung counties. It tended to run out of steam. Whereas the Buildings of England, being very much the work of one man, almost entirely the work of one man, who was incredibly driven, it meant that the series did actually get done. In terms of how it was done, typically the research assistants worked for a year preparing notes of what to look for, what Pevsner should look for when he went out on his travels. The aim was to produce 2 volumes a year, and for Pevsner that meant travelling in the Easter and summer vacations when he wasn't teaching at Birkbeck. Easter and summer vacations, that means 4 to 5 weeks per county. And if you start to think about that and the number of places to be visited in a county and how he fitted it in, you start to feel, I certainly start to feel a little bit dizzy at the thought of how he managed it. And of course, there were other problems at the time, notably petrol rationing. So the actual work of travelling started with Middlesex, where Pevsner, where Penguin Books were actually based at Harmondsworth, so not too much travelling involved there. That was in the summer of 1947. And in the foreword to Middlesex, he actually wrote, published in 1951, he actually wrote, "Finally, the work of compilation could not have been done if my wife and Miss Marjorie Stern, who was then my secretary, had not day in and day out driven an obstreperous vintage 1932 car through the county." And this letter gives some indication of the sort of practical difficulties that he faced. I hope you can perhaps read that, but I'll read it out. He's writing to Alan Lane in 1947, and he says, "Here is the cheque for the 5,000 francs. This must have been something to do with getting around exchange regulations, I think. And also coupons for 21 gallons of petrol, the balance of what I was granted and did not use. What is going to happen next spring? Do you think there is any chance of getting the petrol permit for Cornwall? It cannot be done with less than 60 gallons plus the journey, which is long. I suppose we shall have to start applying about Christmas, and I hope you will help. It is a case of all or nothing, for a county just cannot be done with less petrol or without a car. Regarding the car, she has been like a lamb since the repair I had done, but there are still the following things which need attention according to the mechanics who have seen it. The direction indicator does not work. The spare wheel has a puncture. The solenoid, is there such a thing, is broken and needs replacement. I should be grateful if Mr. Smith would examine it thoroughly. I shall, of course, if I get petrol, start in time, reminding you of the date at which I intend to go on tour. It's probably going to be March the 28th. Well, as you can see, there were considerable sort of practical difficulties. Yes, he had this obstreperous vintage 1932 car. Certainly wasn't a Phantom 3 Rolls-Royce like the one we saw a moment ago, but it was in fact a Wolseley Hornet. And this is a Wolseley Hornet, which I happened to see when I was working on Essex. I saw it tucked away at the back of a garage for sale, and I was sorely tempted to buy it, but I think that would have been taking devotion to Pevsner too far, and could have landed me in an awful lot of trouble. Cornwall, just mentioned, that was actually the first volume to be published. Nottinghamshire and Devonshire followed, travelling there in 1948 to 9. Nottinghamshire was the only county for which he drove himself. He learned how to drive. I think he thought that he ought to be able to drive. He ought to be able to do it himself, but it was an absolute disaster. He really couldn't manage the car. There was some dreadful incident with a paraffin heater and his raincoat, which was never quite the same again. So he never actually drove himself after that. And Hertfordshire, of course, was another very early volume, number 7 in the series. So he went out on the road, usually with his wife, almost invariably with his wife, and they stayed in pubs and hotels. And he would write up the day's entries that evening, hence the dedication of one of the Yorkshire volumes to those publicans and hoteliers of England who provide me with a table in my bedroom to scribble on. As you can imagine, he had very strong views about what hotels should provide in the way of furnishings. And here actually is a letter which he wrote to the Observer in 1958, and in which he says that we stay in about 50 to 60 English hotels in the course of 1 year, from the lowest pub to the not quite luxury hotel. Our experience of hotel rooms is therefore both vast and varied. It is also permanently up to date and on the whole depressing. Nearly all the rooms in which we stay are unreasonably furnished. And he goes on to say what he would like to find in a room. Everything from the bedside table and the bedside lamp, and the table to write on. And lighting, he says, is a problem much connected with economy. What is needed in every room is a ceiling light with a strong bulb, a bedside light, and a basin cum mirror light, a plug for those who use electric shavers, an electric or gas fire with a 6 millimeter. So he'd really got it all down to a T as to what he would like, but very rarely did find in the typical English hotel. I mentioned the dedication of the Yorkshire volume, and collecting Pevsner dedications is a bit of a hobby among some people. The 1968 volume of Bedfordshire was dedicated to the inventor of the iced lolly, from which one deduces that when he was travelling around Bedfordshire, it was a particularly hot summer. It was a punishing schedule, as I've already indicated. The record apparently was 19 parishes visited in one day. That was Warwickshire, published in 1966. And 19 parishes, that means at a minimum 19 churches, plus perhaps, say, 40 other buildings. When he got back to the hotel in the evening and wrote up the day's travels, he was just working late into the night. And here is an extract from a letter that he sent back to the office on one of his tours. He says, he writes a letter on some business matter, and then he says, "I should now fill the rest of this page with nice human bits, but it's no good. The journeys are just not human. To bed 11 o'clock, 11:30, too tired even to read the paper. Up this morning at 6 to scribble, scribble, scribble. If only one could be proud of the result." Modest to the end. The last building that he visited was in 1970. That was in Staffordshire, and Staffordshire was published in 1974. And here he is with the results of his labours on the buildings of England: 32 solo volumes, 10 written jointly, and just 4 actually completely dedicated to other authors. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, they have followed on, written entirely by other people, as do the second editions. He did not spend time on the second editions himself. He called, ever modest, he called the first editions ballon d'essai, that is sort of trial runs, and said it is the second editions that count. But he knew that he had to get the framework in place and complete the series if it was not to be left incomplete, like so many others. And for example, when on the revision of Essex, he wrote, "I do think that the publication of future volumes is worth more than perfection for a second edition," which is why he left it to others. So he was in Hertfordshire in 1951, we know that much. And I have to say, he did have rather mixed views of the county. The title of the talk, my talk, was "Few Counties Are as Interesting as Hertfordshire," but like the best critics, I've taken that slightly out of context. What the full quote is, "For architectural development in the 20th century, few counties are as interesting as Herts." So he had a very particular view of Hertfordshire as to what interested him in it. And we do get just one slight glimpse. Don't get many glimpses of how he felt as he was actually travelling around, because he didn't bother to keep a diary as he was travelling around. He wouldn't have had the time. But he did in 1951, when he was he was on holiday in France, lucky man, and he was sitting in a cafe writing a letter to a friend back in England, and he says, "The wines are delicious, the sun kindly, the humour excellent." And he continued somewhat resignedly, but he would see his friend again after we have eaten our way through Hertfordshire for the wretched guides. So only sort of 4 or 5 years in, it was beginning to get him down. I like the way of eating one's way through Hertfordshire. I think it would be a very pleasant experience these days. Well, not these days, but in recent times. But I guess in 1951, it might not have been quite so attractive a prospect. He also complained that there was little solitude in Hertfordshire, with buses reaching into every corner, light industry mushrooming in all directions, and an inordinate number of mental hospitals. And Susie Harris, Pevsner's biographer, tells how he turned up at one mental hospital, and when he was stopped at the door, he protested, "I am Professor Pevsner," Which the doorman replied, "That's a new one. You're not getting out, you." Alas, I mean, that's a very good story which she told about Hertfordshire, but I'm afraid Susie Harris did rather muddle her counties, because the asylum in question was Coney Hatch at Friar Barnet in Middlesex, but it is a shame to spoil a good story, and there was certainly no shortage of asylums in Hertfordshire. The one on the screen now, that's the old Middlesex County Council Asylum at London Coney. It's Water Tower, an intriguing landmark seen from the M25. All these hospitals have closed, of course, most of them, like this one, converted to luxury housing. But the confusion on Susie Harris's part is understandable, because the boundaries in this part of the country, and in particular this part of Hertfordshire, have shifted a certain amount over the years. This is the map of Hertfordshire as it was in 1953, when the first edition was published. And of course, you can see here, down at the bottom here, we've got Middlesex sort of encroaching right up into here, round, sort of looping in round Chipping Barnet, which was then in Hertfordshire. By the time the second edition came out in 1977, Greater London had come into being. That was in 1965. Therefore, Middlesex had disappeared off the map. But there were various places now which we're in we have a real sort of mishmash of places down here. Some of which were in London, some of which were now in Hertfordshire. So one of the first things to do with the new edition, the 2019 edition, was to bring the borders up to date. So we've now lost from this Pevsner volume those places that were sort of around here, the Chipping Barnet, and so on, because those are now covered by the North London volume. One actually has to look quite carefully at the map when doing this sort of job, because it is terribly easy to miss a place altogether. And indeed, Pevsner did miss out one or two places altogether, not necessarily the most significant places, but one example, for example, is Wilston, right over here in the west of the county near Tring, which doesn't get included in either of the previous editions at all. It has a church by Carpenter and Inglow, 1877-8, not the greatest building. It was actually described as, in the Bucks Herald, as an unpretending edifice, which I think just about sums it up. But it does tie in with other churches that Carpenter and Inglow were doing in the neighbourhood. So it is definitely worth including. And there are also one or two other nice houses in the village that one wouldn't want to lose altogether. Some places, the old entries just seem sort of totally inadequate, really, and there are many reasons for that one can offer explanations for it. But Hexton, for example, the village in the north, right on the northwest border of the county, both the previous editions include the church and the Iron Age hill fort, but there's absolutely no mention of the estate village, which is actually rather good of its kind and something that people are very much more interested in these days than perhaps they were back in the 1950s. So there on the right, that's a general view of the estate village with very distinctive estate housing, including the pub, and on the left, rather fine entrance gates to Hexton Manor, which you really think ought to have been included in previous editions. There it is, mid-18th century house with additions of 1900. It was on sale in 2018. I don't know what's become of it now. The other thing that there seems to be an awful lot of in Hertfordshire, don't intend that in any sort of criticism, but it's just a fact of life, quite a lot of internal administrative reorganisation, with places being slightly moved around from one civil parish to another, or the boundaries being redrawn. So, for example, that means that we now have an official place, as it were, called Hertford Heath, which needs its own new entry. This is Ewan Christian's Holy Trinity Church of Little Amwell, which in previous editions was found under Little Amwell. This incidentally had a very brief entry, just simply a one-liner saying Holy Trinity, Little Amwell, and the date. Now has a rather longer entry, in particular, has an interesting interior with that upsidal east end, and some nice details like glass by Warden Hughes on the right, and this monument on the left by F.J. Williamson, who's one of Queen Victoria's favoured sculptors. Another example of some changes very nearby, of course, is Haileybury, which had a separate entry in previous editions, still has its own separate entry in the same way that major country houses, for example, would be given a separate entry. But the entry there has been very much expanded to take account of new research, such as the important part played by Humphrey Repton and his landscaping of the grounds, and bringing the story up to date with new, for example, new girls' boarding houses by Studio E architects of 1999 to 2002. And you can sort of get an impression here of how the boarding houses are sort of built over at one end. They actually cantilever over these ponds, which were part of Repton's landscaping. Just go back to the subject of those inordinate mental hospitals and similar asylums, because there were a lot of them around the county. This is the London Orphan Asylum in Watford by Henry Dawson, 1869 to 71, with this rather nice sculpture over the entrance by F.M. Miller. If you look very carefully, you can just see on the left, sort of bottom left of the sculpture, you can see the sculptor's signature there. And I like to think that no one's ever really noticed that before I looked at it, and so I'm pleased to be able to give credit to the sculptor in this case. There was an amazing establishment, the Orphan Asylum, very much ahead of its day. It actually included a swimming bath for the children, and it housed an enormous place. It housed 300 boys and 150 girls in houses of 50, long since closed, of course, and again, now converted to housing. A similar story, but a rather different setup at Harpenden, National Children's Home, as it was called, by Holman and Goodrum, 1912 to 13, where the children were housed in a very much more domestic setting, in sort of groups of 6 or 10 in individual houses. And this was the way in which the thinking was going in terms of how to provide accommodation for orphans. The whole setup is still very much there. And when I visited, it was occupied by an organisation called Youth with a Mission. This is a school, of course. This is the Royal Masonic School for Boys at Bushey by Gordon Lowther and Gunton, 1900 to 1902, closed in 1977, stood empty for many years. Again, an absolutely enormous building, require a lot of work and clever thinking as to what to do to it. Finally converted to housing from 1998. And the other building type that has had to be dealt with one way or another in recent years is the workhouse, the old workhouses. This is Bishop Stortford Workhouse, 1836 to 7. Again, you can see here the sort of central core of it has been converted to housing, and the workhouse itself, which, like so many of them, had an afterlife, as it were, as a hospital after the creation of the NHS, the hospital itself, superseded in 2001 to 3 by the Herts and Essex Community Hospital. The reuse of buildings is a particular theme running through the revisions of the buildings of England, because there has, across the board, there has been such so many changes in the way in which buildings of former ages have been reused. Particularly in Hertfordshire, there are many interesting examples of country houses which have had to find an alternative use. This is Balls Park, a fascinating, somewhat if not puzzling house of circa 1640, just outside Hertford. This became a training college in 1946 with a lot of new, very sort of low quality buildings erected in the grounds. All of those swept away as part of redevelopment and adaptation of the site. The house itself very nicely converted to apartments and some sympathetic new housing in the grounds. This is Langleybury at Hunton Bridge, a house of 1726 to 9. And like Balls Park, this was taken over by the county council after the Second World War and was a school from 1949 to 1996 with these buildings erected in the grounds. It all looks pretty derelict now. And here's the interior, but it's not actually quite as derelict as it looks. The first time I tried to visit, they were in the middle of shooting Harlots, which is now all over the BBC, and I'm afraid you won't be released until after it started at 9 o'clock this evening, if you're following it. But the house in its own way still is, as it were, earning its keep. Other houses have gone other houses have gone into the private sector. This is Goldings, which I know some of you will be very familiar with, by George Devey for Robert Smith of 1871 to 7. This went through its institutional phase, being Bernardo's Homes from 1921, and then converted again with new housing in the grounds from about 1998. Another example is the house called Poles at Thundridge, designed by Ernest George and Peto for Edmund Smith Hanbury of the Brewing family, built in 1890 to 2. Became a convent school in 1923, which was when this great block here was added, and converted into a hotel and health club in 1988 to 90. I mean, miraculously, really, the interiors survive. This is the staircase hall, and you can see from this on the right there, that is Ernest George's original design for one of the rooms, and there is the room itself on the left now, and you can see in all its essential details, plasterwork, chimney piece, and so on, it has survived intact. Most of the time, I have been dealing with changes of use, alterations to buildings. There have been surprisingly few demolitions that I've had to take account of. The big phase of demolitions in Hertfordshire really took place before the second edition of 1977. There's one very peculiar demolition, which is the Lee Valley Regional Park Lido, which gets into a footnote in 1977 because it was under construction at that time. It was completed in 1978, but it closed in 2008. And now all that's left is this extraordinary site of steps leading up to a podium on which the Lido building stood. But now there is absolutely nothing there. And I feel that future generations will come upon this in the way that we come across the ruins of some ancient civilization, and there will be endless debates as to what this massive structure was used for. Can't really call this a demolition as such, but this is a building that was in Hertfordshire in 1977, was still in Hertfordshire then, but is no longer. It's Temple Bar, of course, at Tybbalds, by Christopher Wren of 1672. And in 1977, Bridget Cherry wrote of it, "The building is in a shocking state at the time of writing, despite the hideous concrete fence intended to protect it." It had been at Tybbalds since 1888, and its relocation back, the relocation to St Paul's was completed in 2004. Tybbalds, there was the mansion of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, that King James I made Cecil surrender in exchange for Hatfield Palace, and much work has been done to the park there. In recent years, probably looks even better than that now that the hedging has grown up a bit, and the replacement house for the original Tybbalds, which is where the Temple Bar was, that belonged for a long time to the London Borough of Enfield, who did good restoration work on it, and that is now a hotel. Some other restorations. This is a structure that was again giving cause for concern in 1977. Scott's Grotto at Ware, built by the Quaker poet John Scott in the 1760s, derelict for many years, but restored again in 1990 to 1991. And similarly, when Bridget Cherry was looking around Hertfordshire, the gazebos along the River Lee at Ware, they were in a pretty shocking state, but they were restored in the 1980s. A coming together of Hertfordshire County Council, the Ware Society, and local architects Rock Townsend. Bridget Cherry particularly mentions buildings being at risk in 1977, Berkhamsted Town Hall by E.B. Lamb, 1859, now looking very splendid, nicely restored. Another building at risk in 1977 was this, Batchworth Heath House at Rickmansworth, derelict at the time of writing, she wrote, but again, nicely restored, as we can see here. I won't pretend that the picture is all rosy. There is always, I suspect, ongoing development in Watford. This is the halfway through the extension of that monstrous shopping centre in the middle of Watford, where you can see the facade of the Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Bank there being held up by scaffolding by local Watford architect C.P. Ayres of 1895. I haven't been back there to see how that has got on, but here's a picture that I took from Google Street View, which shows that facade rather uncomfortably squashed between new build and, of course, with nothing original behind it. And when I was looking around Watford, there were two grade 2-star buildings which were in a very dire state, really empty and at risk. This is Little Castlebury, lovely late 17th century house, the best classical house in Watford. Not that there was a lot of competition, but apparently, as I looked on the at-risk register, the latest one, it says discussion ongoing about future use of the building, so we haven't given up on that yet. And also Frogmore House of 1716, which I understand is in the process of being converted to office use. So there is hope for that building. When I saw it, it didn't have its rather fine door case, which should be there, and you can see on the right in an old photograph, but that was had actually been saved and put into storage. So no doubt we'll go back. Here's a building that actually got away from Watford. This is Grebe House, now in Verulamium Park in St Albans, a medieval timber-framed house moved there by the County Architects Department from Watford High Street in 1981-2. The County Architects Department did an awful lot of good work around the county, restoring particularly the medieval timber-framed buildings. This is the Great Barn at Croxley Green, one of the series of barns built by Abbot John de la Motte between 1396 and 1401. And incidentally, again, this is a building type that a lot of research has been done on in recent years, and that I've been able to take advantage of in the new edition. I couldn't possibly let the evening go without mentioning the Hertfordshire Building Preservation Trust. This is Place House Ware, restored and converted by the Trust when the floor was taken out. And this building, now dated to the third quarter of the 13th century, again, advances in technique enable us to say that with some certainty, whereas in 1977 it was still assigned to the 14th century. And these, just because I think they're so lovely, the cottages in Water Lane, Hertford, restored by the Trust in 1971-2 by John Snellgrove Associates. As well as buildings changing, attitudes to buildings have changed a lot in the intervening years. This is St James High Wyche by G.E. Pritchett, 1860-1, which Pevsner described as perversely ugly and an eminently typical example of high Victorian design at its most revolting. That was his description in 1953, which was not modified by Bridget Cherry in 1977. I don't think any serious architectural historian would describe a building of that age and indeed that quality in those terms now. But the fact that Pevsner was using those words in 1953 is of interest in itself, and therefore I have kept his description in a footnote. That whole setup there in the village is a very remarkable one, because as well as the church, the incumbent there built. There's the rather splendid interior of St James with its decoration painted straight onto the brick, which is quite unusual. I think normally expect to find it on top of plaster. As well as the church, Pritchett designed the school, seen here, also a vicarage and what was called the curatage, for the curate, and also in an outlying part of the parish, a mission church. So in spite of the examples I've given you, the process of revision is actually not so much about what has changed. Most of the buildings that I saw in 2015 to 18 were there when the earlier editions were compiled, but with fatter volumes and a more inclusive approach, and with the benefit of new research, much that was left out for whatever reason can now be included. So I'm going to try and illustrate this process by looking at one particular village, Hartingfordbury, which I expect will be familiar to many of you and is easily accessible if not. Now, when Bridget Cherry was preparing the second edition, she actually paid little attention to the churches because she thought that Pevsner would have covered them thoroughly, which to our eyes perhaps he didn't. And that did mean that there was quite a lot for me to add, particularly in respect of 19th century restorations and furnishings and fittings. So at Hartingfordbury, there was a restoration in 1888 to 1891, which was instigated by Earl Cooper. and carried out, as far as I could see, by workmen from his Panshanger estate and overseen by his clerk of works, Charles Godfrey, rather than employing an established architect. But nonetheless, they did a very good job, and it was a high quality job. Inside, there's some very lavish alabaster fittings carved by Farmer and Brindley of London. The only downside to this was that in putting in the new fittings, they took out the 14th century sedilia, which ended up in the churchyard as a rather unsatisfactory churchyard ornament. There's also a discrete extension to the church of 2011 to 12 by the Michael Dales Partnership. Pevsner was very strong on monuments. He was interested in monuments. One of his party tricks, as it were, was to go into a church, to walk down the nave, point out, as he walked, he would point at the church, he would point at the monuments and say 1750, 1813, just dating them on the trot by their style, and apparently he got it pretty much spot on every time. But nonetheless, I was able to add a few more, including this one in the churchyard to Pauline Whitney Paget, who died in 1916. This is a listed monument, but the listing description did not know who the sculptor was, and I think they actually described it incorrectly. I was very pleased to be able to identify it as the work of Lady Theodora Gleichen, and it was featured here in an article on her work at the time of her death in the Sphere of 11th of March 1922. Next to the church, there's Hartingbury Park, an early 17th century house remodeled in 1816 and again later in the 19th century. I mean, it looks mostly 19th century, doesn't it, from the outside, and again in the 20th century. Now a school. And to the north of the church, the old rectory, an intriguing building mostly of 1791, but incorporating older parts dating back to 1638. Neither of these buildings were mentioned in earlier editions of Pevsner, and a surprising omission from the earlier editions is Mayflower Place by Charles Harrison Townsend. I say surprising because he was very much the sort of architect whom Pevsner admired. It was built as the village hall by Lady Cooper in 1910, and it's one of those buildings that looks very much more charming in the architect's drawing on the left there than perhaps it does in reality. The influence of the Coopers can be seen also at Birch Green, part of the separate part of the parish, with the primary school here, built by Earl Cooper in 1848-9, designed by Daniel Hollingsworth of Hertford. There are also some decent estate cottages and a war memorial on the left there by Herbert Baker that is a very close match for the one he did at Tuin on the right there. And Tuin also has a Cooper school designed by Hollingsworth. So interesting to see the connections there, the influence of the Cooper family and the estate spread over two separate villages. And none of the buildings that I've mentioned since the church are to be found in the second edition. And I will mention just one more building, Roxford House, also in the parish, not in the first edition, but added by Bridget Cherry, who describes it as early 18th century with later additions. And she based her entry, doesn't disguise the fact, the entry is put into brackets, which means that she didn't see it herself, but it's derived from what other people have written. So she took her entry from the listed building description, which says that the house was extended in 1960 by E. Maxwell, which is an error on the lister's part, which conceals the name of one of the 20th century's most highly respected modernist architects E. Maxwell Fry, another architect whom Pevsner greatly admired, and he has high praise for Fry's little winch house at Chipperfield of 1934 to 5. Would Pevsner have approved of this? I really don't know. He certainly would have known about it, because this photograph comes from the Architectural Review, which he would have seen. And in that article, it has this marvelous line. It was decided to make no attempt to continue the style of the existing house, which I think must be one of the understatements of the century. Nearly finished, but before I go, I'm just going to cover a question which may come up. The people often ask me what my favourite building is, and actually it's a question I hate having to answer. But in Hertfordshire, I would say that nothing has given me more pleasure than something which is not strictly speaking a building, but it is certainly a man-made structure which qualifies it for inclusion in the buildings of England, and that is the New River. And I just love the way it winds gently through the county, helps to create this, what I think is one of the loveliest spots in the county, actually, within 5 minutes walk of Hertford Station. And I love the way it crops up in unexpected places. Here it is running in front of the church at Broxbourne, even crossing the M25 in its concrete aqueduct, thousands of motorists a day blissfully unaware of what they're driving under. But above all, it is still doing the job it was designed to do 400 years ago, quietly and without fuss. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. Pevsner himself thought that the New River at Great Amwell was one of the most delightful spots in Hertfordshire, and he went on at great length about it and was uncharacteristically effusive about it. So do turn that up if you have a moment. I've slightly expanded the entry, but I have kept most of his words. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to remind myself of some of the many delights of Hertfordshire. I did really enjoy working in the county. I've missed not going back to it since then, and I might say miss it now and ever. If some of what you've seen has inspired you to acquire your own copy of the book and you haven't done so already, or indeed you're thinking of Christmas presents, there is a special offer which I've arranged with Yale so that you can obtain it at rather less than the current recommended retail price. I won't mention Amazon. If you want to go and look at Amazon, you may find it's even cheaper than that, but they don't tend to hold their prices for very long at Amazon. But there we are. Thank you very much for listening to me. And can we just leave that up for the moment?
James, I think
we start on questions,
probably,
or would you like to take it down?
Well, just as you like. If you'd like to return share screen or just go to your full frame, just as you like.
Well, we could stop sharing now, and if anyone wants that that information, perhaps we can put it up later.
Okay. So if you'd just like to click it.
Which is online.
Okay, I'm looking around. I think Malcolm is waving his finger.
Only to say that we probably should be drawing to a close. It has been a completely fascinating evening. And we will all wish to thank James Bettley very warmly. I mean, just to pick out one small detail, I will always look afresh now at the New River, without a doubt. There's something else I wanted to mention as well as thanking James. Hopefully everybody can still hear me. Yes. And that is that this talk was suggested by Celia Gould, one of the members of the society, a couple of years ago. And it took another year or two to make it happen. And very sadly, Celia Gould has just recently died. So this talk this evening is something that will hopefully remind us about Celia Gould, and not least of all her brilliant suggestion that James Bettley should talk about redoing the Hertfordshire Pevsner. She'd heard him talk about redoing the Suffolk Pevsner, and here we are this evening. We've heard this wonderful redoing of the Hertfordshire Pevsner.
May I say a word?
So thank you very much to James. Thank you very much to everyone, and thank you, Celia. Paul's going to say a word or two. That's good.
Right. Just speaking as Celia's partner, and I just wanted to say that we've always loved the Pevsner series, and she moaned for years and years as other counties got their Pevsners. Why aren't they doing Hertfordshire? Where is it? Why won't somebody put up the money? And as soon as it became available on the Yale website, I pre-ordered it some long time before it was actually published. And it was a great day when it arrived. So thanks very much.
And just thank you to everybody for taking part in this brilliant evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you very much.
it's worked very well indeed. And